Hi, I'm Abby Martin. Welcome back to Breaking the Set. So a lot has happened in the last 2 weeks. Chelsea Manning came out as a woman. Egypt remains in chaos, and the U.S. is gearing up to bomb Syria, a move that could potentially jumpstart World War III. But while the international community is focused on a solution to Syria, there's another devastating situation unfolding in Fukushima, Japan. Recently, Japan's nuclear power agency TEPCO reported that 300 tons of radioactive water is being used to cool the reactors has been pouring into the Pacific Ocean every day since the tsunami. But if that isn't bad enough, it turns out that the radiation levels reported thus far are grossly underestimated. See, TEPCO just admitted that radiation levels are actually 18 times higher than what was reported previously. In fact, near the tank, the levels are high enough to kill an exposed person in just 4 hours. Right now, 230 millisieverts of radiation every hour are being measured from one tank alone. What does that mean? Well, one person is only allowed an annual exposure of 50 millisieverts. When you do the math, it doesn't look good. But don't worry, guys. Apparently, that detrimental news is completely inconsequential because the chairman of the Nuclear Regulation Authority said that there's no way to stop it. He said, we cannot fully stop the contaminated water leaks right away, so we should better assess its environmental impact. So let me get this straight. An environmental disaster threatening the fate of humanity isn't enough to get media attention or bring the international community together. No, it seems like world leaders only unify to bomb the next country into oblivion. And if this logic doesn't make sense to you, you've come to the right place. Join me and let's break the set. As the Syrian crisis reaches a boiling point, U.S. leaders are deliberating over what's looking to be yet another military intervention in the Middle East. Just over the last 12 years, the U.S. government has used military action against Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Mali. Now, if you just broaden the scope of history to over the last 30 years, you can see that the U.S. has had an enormous impact on nearly every country in the region. But this military takeover has largely been accomplished under the guise of democracy building and liberation. It's a narrative that historian Peter Kuznick and director Oliver Stone dissect thoroughly in their book and accompanying film series, The Untold History of the United States, where they write, quote, the belief that the U.S. is fundamentally different from other nations, motivated only by a commitment to freedom and liberty, altruistically sacrifices for mankind, has reemerged in recent years as a staple of right-wing historical revisionism. This historical revisionism permeates today throughout the media landscape and political establishment. But superficial rhetoric aside, just how and why did the Middle East become a target for Western interests? Here to help me break down the true nature of U.S. foreign policy and the current conflict with a proper historical lens, I'm joined now by author and historian Peter Kuznick. Thank you so much for coming on, Peter. It's great to have you on again. Peter, just looking at a map of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East over the last 30 years, is it just a coincidence that there's always a humanitarian crisis in the countries that the U.S. has yet to militarily intervene or conquer?
Well, most interventions and wars are justified by the idea that there's some madman out there who's going to do terrible things to our friends or to us. So that's usually what happens. But really underneath that is this idea that you were talking about American exceptionalism. Why is the United States the world's policeman? Who appointed us? Why do we play this role? But if you look at American policymakers, going back to Woodrow Wilson commented, he says, now the world will understand that the United States is the savior of the world. That attitude, Madeleine Albright, more recently, the United States, if we have to use force, it's because we're America. We're the indispensable nation. We stand taller and see farther than other countries. Hillary Clinton, the same thing. Obama, this notion of we're the indispensable nation. What makes us the indispensable nation? Well, we're the most powerful nation. What makes us the most powerful nation? We have the atomic bombs. We had a monopoly on atomic bombs. What right do we have to worry about, to talk about other countries using weapons of mass destruction? We began that process, at least the most serious iteration, with the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And have we apologized for that? Have we criticized that, questioned it? Right now, right outside of Washington, D.C., in the Air and Space Museum Annex, we're displaying the Enola Gay. the plane that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima to start the modern era of weapons of mass destruction. And the head of the Air and Space Museum said, we're going to display the Enola Gay in all of its glory as a magnificent technological achievement. I don't know where we come off being the world's arbiter on these kinds of questions.
It is amazing, and this rhetoric is not only just perpetuated, it's congratulated. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And yeah, as you said, I mean, what gives us the moral authority? When we have used chemical weapons routinely in modern warfare, cluster bombs, white phosphorus, depleted uranium, and a toxic legacy that's worse than Hiroshima.
I wouldn't say it's worse than Hiroshima. But I would say that we've done terrible things. But you were mentioning before, even in terms of Fukushima, the nuclear accident in Japan. Who pushed Japan to develop nuclear energy? Do you know the history of this? It was the United States. It was Eisenhower, as part of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. Why did Eisenhower push the peaceful atom? He thought it would make it easier to justify a policy based on nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare. When Eisenhower, most of me, I ask my students, what do you know about Eisenhower? They'll say, oh, his farewell address, warning about the military-industrial complex. What they don't know is that Eisenhower, when he took office, we had about 1,000 nuclear weapons. When he left office, we had 23,000 nuclear weapons. When his budgeting cycle was finished, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons.
Too late, Eisenhower.
Yeah.
Peeling back that rhetoric from the beginning of the administration. Let's talk about, it's easy to look at the Middle East in a vacuum.
Yes.
But Peter, why is the Middle East so unstable right now? And really, what is the U.S., how much of that has to do with the U.S. policy?
Well, the fact that there was such repressive regimes for so long had a lot to do with U.S. policy. The United States armed these governments, these dictatorships. We supported them politically and militarily. And so for years, they kept a lid on the people there. Then all of a sudden, things unraveled. I mean, in such an unpredictable way. This 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor had been insulted one time too many and set himself on fire. And then the Middle East unraveled. And it was unpredictable. It was unpredictable to American intelligence, to U.S. intelligence. They didn't see this coming, and it spread from Tunisia to one country after another. And there's obviously a yearning for some kind of freedom and dignity and economic and intellectual and political freedom in that area. But there's not much of a tradition of civil government. And there's not much of a tradition. So what you've got are extremists who were repressed for a long time, and you've got military forces, you've got some secular forces, but they were largely repressed also.
Right, a lot of thwarting of the democratic evolution and democratic processes in a lot of these countries, Peter. The Syria situation is causing so many global power players and dynamics to shift that are remnants from the Cold War.
But we unleashed so much of this with our invasion of Iraq.
Right.
We go into situations not having any idea. I mean, Bush, for example, didn't even know there was a difference between Sunnis and Shia. I mean, we go into situations where we're totally blind. We did the same thing in Vietnam. We're going to do the same thing now in Syria if Obama is stupid enough to actually follow through on this policy.
Why is Syria such a linchpin for global powers? And do you really think it's going in blind and not ultimately for destabilizing further the region?
I don't see how anybody's going to benefit from further destabilization in that region. We've got a situation in Jordan that's out of control now with all the refugees who are there. We've got a situation in Iraq where there's dozens of people being killed every day. We've got openings in Iran. We've got some real possibilities. If we could think about this a little more creatively rather than this military option, we have a situation where we should actually be cooperating with Russia and with China. The United States has created a situation of polarization, hostility, and enmity. We look at what the Russians want, and we look at what the Chinese want. One of the things that the Russians are very concerned about is U.S. missile defense. We've had some great leaders in the past in our history, and what made them great was their ability to see the world through the eyes of other countries. Obama hasn't had that ability. He's probably had a little bit more than Bush, but he hasn't really had that. And most American leaders, probably since Carter, maybe the first 2 years, or since Kennedy, have not had that ability. And so you look at, we have to say, how can we bring Russia and China into being part of the solution? What can we offer Russia that might make them more trusting of the United States? What can we offer China? What we're doing now is we've got what we call the Asia pivot. Hillary Clinton announced it in Foreign Policy magazine in November 2011. And she said, it was titled, her article, America's Pacific Century, basically saying we're going to shift out of the Middle East so we can dominate the Pacific, dominate Asia, and contain China. That's been our policy. Maybe we could have a very different kind of approach toward China and toward Russia, in which we could understand some of their concerns about the world as it's evolving, America's nuclear domination, America's economic footprint all over the world. And we could probably, on that basis, bring them into working with us to forge a peaceful solution in Syria and the Middle East. But what we're doing now is further antagonizing them. Obama's refusal to meet with Putin because of what? Because of Snowden. Putin did the right thing. The Russians did the right thing in allowing Snowden in. What he exposed, just like what Assange has exposed, what Manning has exposed, is really what's underneath this empire, this secret world that these people have created. And they're very upset when you start to unravel that, when you talk about the NSA surveillance. When you talk about just a massive surveillance of American citizens. We now found out that it's going on through the anti-drug efforts on an even bigger scale, to some extent, than what's going on through the NSA. There's a world out there of secrets, and a democracy is supposed to be transparent. Obama ran as a transparency president. He was critical of Bush's secretness. And what did Obama do? He actually put more layers of secrecy around U.S. policy. More things were being classified. But it's that kind of crazy world in which any time you expose this, people feel so threatened that they crack down further. We saw what happened with Manning. I mean, we have a world in which if you commit war crimes, you walk free, like Bush and Cheney. If you expose war crimes like Manning, you spend most of your life in jail. Our values have been turned upside down. That's what Oliver and I are trying to show in our Untold History, in our book and our documentaries, that the United States once stood for something. We weren't always true to it, but we once stood for something that was other than surveillance, other than drone attacks, other than targeted assassinations, other than putting people in Guantanamo. So when the United States talks about the Syrians violating international norms, it reads like a satirical masterpiece.
It is amazing that the U.S. claims moral authority to, provoke militarily any such country. Peter Kuznick, must-see, Untold History of the United States, must-see documentary film and book. Everyone check it out. Peter, I need you on again to analyze so much more. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Abby.
Still ahead, Team Obama is beating the war drums when it comes to Syria. We'll talk with a panel after the break to determine what the best course of action is. The White House is making a hard sell for a military strike on Syria now that Congress has started to reconvene in Washington. Today, the administration met with significant Republicans and Democrats while sending top cabinet officials to testify before Congress. In a meeting with congressional leaders, Obama went to great lengths to distinguish Syria from other U.S.-led wars. He said, this is not Iraq and this is not Afghanistan. Obama also made the argument that intervention would be calculated. He said it would be proportional, it's limited. It does not involve boots on the ground. And already his call for support has won the approval of Speaker John Boehner, one of the most influential politicians in the House. With Boehner's backing of Obama's plan, it's speculated that we should now expect full congressional consent for military intervention in the country. But even if Congress does approve a military strike on Syria, is this the right course of action? Joining me now to discuss both sides of the argument is Mouaz Moustafa, Executive Director for the Syrian Emergency Task Force, and Brian Becker, National Coordinator for the Answer Coalition. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on. Very tense topic. Mouaz, you've been on the ground in Syria multiple times since the civil war broke out 2 years ago. In fact, you're one of the liaisons between the FSA and this administration. Why does the U.S. need to strike right now?
Well, the fact is that the United States, first of all, I think I'm coming here not to defend previous U.S. policy or the ones now. What we understand now is that the European allies, our allies in the region, including Turkey and others in the region, have all called, and the president, who himself put himself in a tough position by calling a red line, which is the use of chemical weapons used multiple times by the Syrian regime, has now come to a point where there is inaction of the United Nations Security Council due to the Russian veto. Nobody can go around that. And the international community has been really pressuring him hard to do something about it. So I think a strike now is important because we we have seen when Assad's used chemical weapons before and there was no repercussions, he used them again on a much larger scale. And so there's that, but there's also the need for a political solution to the crisis. And in order to get that, the Assad regime's inner circle must understand that they are not immune from international action, thus pushing Assad to truly sitting down at the negotiating table.
Can you explain really quickly what exactly is a proportional limited strike?
I think in this case, it is a strike that can, first of all, deter him from further use of chemical weapons, to know that he cannot just use these and continue on, because he looks at them as just normal weapons within his arsenal, not weapons that this entire planet has decided should never be used against civilians ever. And number two, to help hinder his ability to target civilians, as we see every day. And only a month ago, I was back again in Syria, and I saw as barrels were dropped down on residential neighborhoods from Russian MiGs that took out many civilian targets that had nothing to do with FSA positions being anywhere close to them.
Brian, you've been a vocal opponent for military intervention. Why?
Well, 90% of the people in the United States oppose another war in the Middle East. They've seen Afghanistan, they saw Iraq, they saw Libya, and now Syria. The United States government doesn't go to a war because a particular government uses a particular weapon, a heinous weapon, chemical weapons, and of course there's no proof that the Assad government used chemical weapons. The Obama administration is saying, well, we're keeping it secret. We're going to tell Congress the American people get a redacted version of the evidence. There is no categorical evidence. But more than that, the United States government does not have the right, the legal right, the moral right, the political right to be judge, jury, and executioner. The real reason they're going in is not for a proportional, limited strike. It's an escalating strategy. They sent direct arms shipments to the rebels in June. They've been coordinating a civil war for 2.5 years. Now the U.S. will begin the direct military engagement. Why? To take out the Assad government, not because of human rights, not because of chemical weapons. They don't want independent nationalist governments in this oil-rich region of the world.
Mouaz, how can we be sure that this won't be another Iraq or Afghanistan?
Sure. No, first of all, I want to agree on the first point. The American public does not want to take part in any military intervention for whatever reasons.
Including the Syrian war, including a war in Syria.
I'm agreeing with you. So I'm agreeing with him that including the Syrian war.
Disingenuously, I think.
Okay, can I tell that?
You surely can.
Okay, thank you. So again, I agree with him. I thought he wasn't. I thought he would like that. I agreed with him on these issues. They don't want another war. They don't want one in Syria. They don't want intervention anywhere else. They don't want a repetition of Iraq or Afghanistan. So have the Syrian people been very vocal opponents of the invasion of Iraq and the mishandling of Afghanistan. I think that is something important to note. But Iraq was not an indigenous populist revolution that went on for 8 months, and I didn't remember Mr. Becker come out once and say anything about a dictator that used gunshots and used unlawful arrests against peaceful protesters, again, for 8 months. As far as the proof of chemical weapons, unequivocal evidence have been put for the multiple uses before this specific one, and on this one it's simply logic, and I can present the facts, but I want to answer your questions. I just also I'm sorry, but I just want to answer your question as far as, if you can remind me.
Why is this different? I mean, how can we be so sure that this will come out differently?
Why is this different? This is different because, first of all, it is an indigenous revolution that's been calling out, because all of our allies are calling upon us to do this. The only reason we don't have a UN Security Council resolution is the Russian veto. Number three, President Obama himself, I would say his policy on Syria has not been exactly stellar. And the reason we are here now, and we are at a point where we only have terrible options. Look, I'm a Syrian. Do you think I want cruise missiles to go towards my country that I was born in? Absolutely not. But we are at a point where we have only terrible options. And this is different because this would be a limited strike that afterwards we will not be involved in ground troops. We will not be involved in an open-ended conflict. It will end, and we will move on back to the stage where we were before, which hopefully is, well, I mean, the stage before was terrible for the Syrian people, but again, back on the path to where it's the Syrian people versus the dictator, completely abandoned by the international community.
And I can see that's a very emotional issue because you are Syrian. And Brian, what do you think this war is really about?
Well, I think it's really about domination for the U.S. over the Middle East. Again, the resource-rich, geostrategically important. The Assad government isn't isolated. The Assad government has a very large popular support. The Assad government was winning the war in Syria. The opponents, the armed groups who actually get all of their guns from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, they can't win the war. The only way they could win the war is to draw in Western intervention. What did they need to do for that? They needed to have somebody say, the Syrian government crossed the red line. Why would the Assad government, winning the war, having a broad base of popular support, having international allies, do the one thing, the one very thing that would automatically draw in U.S. and perhaps NATO intervention, the one thing that would cause him to lose the war? We think that this is a staged provocation. The United States government before was trying to carry out regime change against Assad through the agency of civil war. They're now using direct military intervention, saying no boots on the ground. That's a terrible thing to tell the American people. It's so urgent, we must bomb Syria, but we want to make sure the Syrians are the only ones who do any bleeding. That's a terrible example of a government that is not, in fact, following international law. The United States government is not threatened by Syria, not threatened by the Syrian government. The people of the United States are not threatened. Now the United States government says we, America, because we're powerful, have arrogated to ourselves the right to decide who will be punished, who will be bombed. That's not the road to peace.
Well, that's a good point, because considering, even if Assad did use chemical weapons this last time, I haven't seen any evidence to prove that. But even if he was behind the attack, Mouaz, why does the U.S. have moral authority to militarily intervene in countries when we routinely use chemical weapons during modern warfare?
Right. No, I mean, as I stated when I first came here, I'm not here to defend previous U.S. policy on stuff. Again, I even stated certain parts where I thought U.S. policy was bad, the invasion of Iraq, based on false evidence.
But this rhetoric, you are defending it.
No, the thing is, we cannot just simply say that anything the United States does is just going to be bad. I think we live now in a world where we need to rely not only on our ideology, which is very important, but on principles, right? International law is not using chemical weapons. I mean, that's very important to remember. And I don't know when was the last time that Mr. Becker was in Syria, but if he goes to Aleppo province, Idlib province, Deir ez-Zor province, northern Latakia province, Daraa province, and I can list a few others, Hasaka province for that matter, he won't find very many people that are his popular support for the Assad regime. The Assad regime is not winning the war. The Assad regime has been losing the war. That's why he was forced to use chemical weapons on a heavily fortified eastern Ghouta, which was, well, I was just there, but on a heavily fortified eastern Ghouta, which he could not break into. By the way, why didn't he just allow the investigators to go in right away? If he has nothing to hide, we know that the rebels have done it. Let him go in right away. Don't bomb them with Russian tanks for 5 days, destroying the evidence before allowing them to enter. There's nothing to hide. Let them go right away.
The United Nations formally requested the Assad government to give access to weapons inspectors on Saturday, August 24th. Within 24 hours, they were granted access. And soon as Syria granted the UN weapons inspectors access, John Kerry said the weapons inspection should be canceled because the Syrian government has delayed too long. In other words, the U.S. government really didn't want the weapons inspections, and now they say, and as John Kerry said the other day in his speech, it's irrelevant because their mission is not to apportion blame. So the United States has it both ways. Assad is delaying the UN inspections, but if he lets them in, the UN inspections are irrelevant.
He never let them in, and he delayed their...
Let me speak really quickly, though. Mouaz, if you...
These were just lies, but you can address them or not.
I want to move on, though, because, Mouaz, you're saying that, of course, other military interventions, it's really incomparable now to talk about Syria because it's so different. But, I mean, you can't discount the fact that it's extremely hypocritical for this country to invade or militarily intervene in a country that uses chemical weapons. So what do you think this war is really about? Do you really think it's about humanitarian reasons?
Look, the United States acts in its national interests constantly. This is the way it goes about it. I mean, if anybody has any qualms. Sometimes, in crazy world of coincidences, at times, the U.S. national and strategic interests can happen to align with some more core morals and values that this country was built upon, that your previous guest was saying this country had these principles in the past before.
Situation...
And I think in this situation, absolutely. And I think in Kosovo and in Bosnia, which I'm sure the Russian government, for example, wasn't completely on board with that, we have democracies now, and we stopped Srebrenica, which was after a genocide that took place. Rwanda, we never acted. We should have. Iraq, we shouldn't. Bahrain, we should definitely act.
So John
absolutely.
McCain and Lindsey Graham and these people who have never met a war that they don't like, the mouthpieces for American militarism, the people who always want to intervene, always want to bomb, and now want to bomb your country, and you're in alignment with them, and you say, that's just a temporary alliance. Why are you on the same side with John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and all the war makers, the people who always love war?
That's a great question, sir. It's a great question. But my answer is, I don't use what John McCain votes yes on or no on to make decisions. I make my decisions based on facts and realities on the ground.
Really quickly, we're almost out of time. Brian, could this strike escalate into a regional war?
Well, it is a regional war. The United States has taken out the Libyan government, the Iraqi government. Now they're trying to take out the Syrian government. Of course, the Iranian government is next. The Hezbollah resistance forces in Lebanon are next. The United States is trying to create an American sphere of influence where 2/3 of the world's petroleum is known to reside. If Iran strikes Israel, if Syria retaliates, which in fact it has a legal right to do based on the security of the UN Charter, Article 51, if attacked, you have a right to retaliate. If any of that happens, yes, this war could go way far beyond Syria and engulf the Middle East. It's very dangerous, high-stakes.
The war is far beyond Syria already, but as we go forward in this, Israel bombed Syria 3 times. Not a single bullet by the resistance you're claiming.
One question. Yes. Only 9% of Americans polled say that they want military action. Why do you think that 90% of people in this country should be ignored?
Polls have shifted. Now it's up to 40%. I mean, that could be discussed anyway. I think people absolutely don't understand what's happening on the ground in Syria. I completely sympathize with them. Again, I have never been against with U.S. intervention, except for something like Kosovo and Bosnia and things like that until now. So I completely understand where they're coming from. But here, what we demand is leadership by the people's representatives and by the United States government to work on a strike that does not involve us in a war that we're already involved in, but it helps us get to a political transition and solution.
On Saturday, this coming Saturday, people in Washington, D.C. and all over the country are coming into the streets to tell Congress, listen to the American people, vote no war in Syria. We don't want another war in the Middle East. We don't need another war.
And we'll be going to Congress to lobby it.
Thank you so much. Mouaz, Moustafa, Brian Becker, really appreciate you guys coming on. Appreciate it. Well, you guys, that's a wrap for us on our first day back. Thank you so much at home for watching, and join me again and break the set tomorrow.